different people at the table, and we just have so much fun and fellowship. And the food is like really good. There's a lot of good cooks and bakers in here. Now, before I make the introduction, I just would like to share something. Ties in with what Joanne shared this morning. Last Sunday, I was at New Orleans at a National School Board conference. And where's Tony at? Is he here? Tony, I had lots of crayfish, or crawdads, as they call them down there, and shrimp. It was so good. But I've noticed in my life that, I'm on the school board 22 years, and I know it's a calling in my life. And when I go to these conferences, it's like church. I really hear God speaking. One thing I heard, and the theme for the whole weekend, was how torn up, how broken apart our board member relationships and superintendent relationships. And because of that, you know who suffer? The children. It's so sad, and that's a smaller segment of our society, but it just really amplifies all that's happening in our society. I got to hear a marvelous speaker, and I heard God through her. Ruby Bridges, I'll let you look her up, made a big difference in 1960. And the amazing thing from her was, at about 33 years old, she knew that God wanted her to do something different. Now, mind you, this is at a national school board conference where religion is not talked about. And she talked about how she spent time in her prayer closet. And when she came out, she knew that she needed to make a difference in other people's lives. And I'm thinking, wow, us as the church, as Christians, need to begin with that, making a difference in others' lives, and being open and treating every human being, regardless of who or what they think they are or what the color of their skin is. And if we could just start, it would make a difference, because I've often wondered, where's the church? And what God shared with me that day is, hey, you're the church. So with that, I would like to introduce Jeff and Tasha. Great speakers. We've had them before, and they've just led a great class on soul keeping, which I'm still on my journey, but they're going to do a wonderful message this morning. So welcome, Jeff.
Oh, there I'm on. Okay. Yeah, Tim, you just preached our sermon. We can all go home. So, how about that? Yes, we are going to talk about the church today. And I don't know if you are aware of this, but we were sort of hashing this out on the way down this morning, and we realized...
we were talking about it. Hashing sounds like we were
okay, we were talking about it. We were discussing it. But 2 years in July, we've been hanging out here. It's been about 2 years now, and we found Hosanna to be a beautiful place.
Time flies when you're having fun.
I'm sorry?
I said time flies when you're having fun.
Oh, time flies. Yes, it does. Yes. And so what we're going to talk about today in this message, we think represents a lot of what we experience here. Tony would often brag about his church to us doctoral students, and we'd go, okay, it's that good. And it is that good. But we're going to be talking about the church and how the church can be a beautiful place. And we experience that here every week. You have anything else to add?
Nope, that's it.
Okay, all right. Well, the title of this morning's message is, If This Thing Called Church Is Ever Going to Make a Difference. Now, that might be the longest sermon title that I've ever presented. It doesn't roll off the tongue quite easily, but we think it's important to consider how the church intersects with her society at any given time in history. And we're in a part of that history. And we've both been around long enough to know when the church and her surrounding culture played much better together. Tim was sort of highlighting a little bit of that. And I've also researched and studied enough of church history to realize that the church has had her shining moments and her less than stellar moments. If you remember, not too long ago, Tony and Joanne presented some messages from church history. And they were revealing how some new theological concepts developed that helped and even hindered our thinking and theology today. The point is that we live in the aftermath of all of that, good or bad, and we are working with what we have today.
So the question that we want to consider is a real practical one. What kind of difference does the church make today? What will we be known for? Have you ever thought about that question? Some people suppose that if we just believe the right things, that's enough. And we're definitely in favor of forming a solid understanding of how we perceive God and his scriptures and his people. But however, does it make a difference if we have it right just up here? Honestly, we're not here to debate whether we've got it right or we've got it wrong. What we want to do is to make sure that we're aware of what truly constitutes the agenda of the church. It's important for us to get this right, because if we get that wrong, we jeopardize our witness of God's wonderful grace to those around us. So ultimately, we want to help evaluate how the church is called to make a difference. So to do this, we're going to look on one particular New Testament church and Paul's letter to this new band of resident aliens living out their faith in the shadow of a humongous cultural idol. So to do this, we want to prepare our minds for what we're about to hear.
So, Ephesus was a very influential city for its time because it contained one of the 7 wonders of the world, the Temple of Artemis. And that's what's pictured up on your screen. The Ephesians revered Artemis as the goddess of motherhood and fertility, and we can understand a bit of the significance of this goddess by remembering a scene in Acts 19:35 where the silversmiths, they were in an uproar over the declining sale of shrines to the goddess, and the city was rioting over the matter. Paul was in the middle of it until a clerk reminded them of this. Doesn't all the world know that the city of Ephesus is the guardian of the temple of the great Artemis and of her image, which fell from heaven? The goddess was a big deal. And the size of her temple revealed that she was great and powerful. And her reputation was apparently well known throughout the ancient world. So what's the big deal concerning this ancient deity and her temple? Well, because everything in these ancient societies was attached to the temple cult of that city, daily life in Ephesus revolved around the temple. The temple was the central feature of the various systems within the city and throughout the region. Currency was handled in the temple. So the temple was the seat of the banking system within that city. Animals were sacrificed there. So butchering guilds would bring their animals here to be blessed and sacrificed as an aroma to the goddess. This was a major contention for the Jews, since all the meat in the city would be sacrificed to the goddess. We can remember Paul writing in another city, right? In 1 Corinthians 8, where he says, now about food sacrificed to idols, this is what I want you to know. And so the goddess and her temple were greatly admired and honored throughout the city. And before Paul arrived and caused a big ruckus, the whole system operated according to a cultural arrangement surrounding this goddess Artemis. Now, I first remember hearing about some of these details from Dr. Buckwalter as he described the practices around the temple courts. Each day, actors would go out and they would mimic the actions of the goddess before the audiences as part of their worship. They would mimic the actions of the goddess, how she would arise and wake up, how she would bathe, how she would get dressed, and even eat. These actors would reveal the living actions of the goddess. These performances were daily reminders of the favorable presence of this goddess within the city and upon the city. And we can see these deities held power within society and over the people. And here in Ephesus, Paul and the Christian believers were constantly operating in the shadow of this goddess and her great temple.
So as we consider the significance of the goddess, we must consider how Paul might bring this message to the Ephesian church. So as we consider this passage in Ephesians, we want to focus on one verse in chapter 5. Paul literally tells them to mimic God. Not the goddess, but rather our God. So in verse 1, Paul says, "Be imitators of God, therefore, as dearly loved children." The Greek word here is
Mimetai.
mimetai. See, I practiced that word for all morning. And he wakes up and he goes, "What's the word, hon?" And I said, mimetai. And now I'm up here in front of you all and I'm like, yep, it's gone. Mimetai. He even has it's even spelled out phonetically here for me. Sorry. So the Greek word here is mimetai. Just as the temple actors would mimic the goddess, Paul tells these believers to mimic their God.
Mimetai.
Mimetai.
Mimic.
Which is where we get our word mimic. See, why can't I just say mimic? I thought it would make me sound smart.
I tried.
Whatever. Anyway, I am smart. Anyway, so this verse reveals the simple list of attitudes and behaviors that we're about to. This verse reveals the simple list of attitudes and behaviors that we're about to read is more than just an arbitrary list of good qualities. They're derived from these performances that are happening all the time right before their eyes. The passage we're about to read is an about-face to the prevailing culture and a call to represent something. Not only better, but something that's critical to the community of believers, identifying their connection with God. And it's here that we can consider how the church is to make a difference. We are to represent something. Just like actors circulating in the temple courts, we are to mimic, imitate, and represent the beauty and magnificence of our God to our surrounding society. So as we prepare to read this passage this morning, I want you to listen carefully for the calling to be God's people. I'm going to start at Ephesians 4:22 so that we can observe the picture of being clothed to appear like God's true community. Ephesians 4:22. You were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your minds, and to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. Therefore, each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor, for we are all members of one body. In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you're still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. Anyone who has been stealing must steal no longer, but must work doing something useful with their own hands, that they may have something to share with those in need. Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building up others according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. And do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, with whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. Get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger, accusation and slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving one another, just as in Christ God forgave you. Be imitators, mimetai. Therefore, as dearly loved children, and walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and a sacrifice to God. Think about the comparison that Paul is making to their own lives as he calls his audience to imitate or mimic God. To walk in the way of Jesus as he is their fragrant offering and sacrifice. Paul captures their imagination.
Can you see how the Apostle Paul was using their own familiar culture setting to contrast their faith as something to be lived as a countercultural kind of expression within their own society? Paul is looking toward a greater goal than mere adherence to a list of attitudes and behaviors. He's describing a Christian ethic, if you will, which is a guiding expectation for what everyone in the Christian community to live by. When we live under a prevailing ethic, we are authenticating a set of moral principles in order to guide the life of the community. This passage often looks like a general list of rules, doesn't it? A list of things to do or to keep in mind, but I sense Paul is asking us to consider something more than our own individual obedience to a list of attitudes and behaviors. This is not just a set of guardrails for us to, as individuals, to live by. Instead, this is who we are to be. This is how we are to mimic as imitators of God, living before the world as his people, together in community as his representatives. And he's asking us to surrender to a 24/7 to an attractive Christian community ethic that communicates greater splendor than those demonstrations of the goddess that are happening in her festivities.
So, what is this attractive Christian ethic? The Apostle Paul calls the Christian community to act upon their faith by putting off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, and being made new in the attitude of your minds, and to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. Did you catch Paul's language? He's asking us to put off the old self and put on the new self, which makes us look like God's truly righteous, holy people. In other letters, Paul uses similar language to reveal that we are to be clothed anew. So when we consider the following list, I'm not sure that you need me to systematically explain why these attitudes and behaviors are better for each of our individual lives, but that's probably how most of us read this. Instead, we want to help you understand the value of this attractive Christian ethic for living as God's people, the church, within the context of our surrounding communities. Sometimes we lose sight that Paul is speaking to those Ephesians as a group of people together who need to live as God's representative people, not only as individuals living in obedience to God. So whenever we think about a standard to live by, we need to understand the life-giving elements that make it worthwhile to follow as a community together. So, an attractive community, Christian ethic is, first of all, relational. Notice we don't find things here like keeping laws, attending church, or even tithing. What we find are guidelines for our relationships. In other words, our relationship with God establishes how we relate with others. There are behaviors and attitudes that we must remove from our community because they have no place in community that looks like God. Instead, we must behave and think as God desires. And then we allow this way of living to unfold in our relationships with other people. An attractive Christian community is also redemptive. In other words, we're asked to live by a standard above our own strength and ability to accomplish. Have you noticed that things out there are getting a little worse? How often do we hear someone calling us to a higher redemptive standard without tearing others down in the process? In a society without guardrails, people gravitate to some of the most offensive options where all the things that Paul outlines in this passage have often been tossed to the wayside. We are not going to find much that's redemptive if we mimic the world's benchmarks. The Christian faith is about faithfully pursuing God's redemptive purposes. And when we act, our Christian witnesses move forward beyond a passive stance or an understanding. Ours is a lifestyle that has at its core the very things that can change our world.
And I think that's very powerful, don't you? If we are going to make a difference, we must understand that we are called to be relational and redemptive, and an attractional Christian ethic is also reflective. In other words, we have a representative role as God's people, which is found in many New Testament passages. As God reveals his benevolent actions to us, we are to reflect them onward toward others. Theologian N.T. Wright describes this reflective quality as becoming angled mirrors that constantly reflect God's good nature and actions throughout the world. It was our original human mandate in the garden, right? People created in God's image to reflect his glory. It was the calling of Abraham, as he and his offspring were to be a blessing to the world. This was the calling of the Israelites to be a light to the Gentiles. This was the life that Jesus demonstrated as he gave himself up as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. There's that temple imagery. And now this thing called the church is to reflect the image of God to the rest of the world. That's our role. That's why we must guard what our communities hold as a model of attitudes and behaviors. And ultimately, I cannot emphasize enough the concept of living as a community under this relational, redemptive, and reflective ethic. It's truly a community thing. It's not just for us as individuals. It's for all of us. And one more thing before we consider the actual principles for our Christian communities. Let us help you understand the importance of a community living under such an ethic. The wisdom of Proverbs paints the picture of our hearts as well springs from which everything flows. As it says here on the screen, Proverbs 4:23, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Now, this is an individual passage, right? Everything in your life is governed by your heart's condition. If your well is breached and allows mud to seep into your pure intentions, you will draw murky, distasteful water. It just doesn't work any other way. So you must guard the purity of your well, which is your heart, for everything you do flows from it.
So now let's look at this concept communally. So when people in our society find the water from our Christian church communities distasteful, perhaps it may indicate that we're not doing so well at guarding the wellspring, which means that we may not be doing so well at living an attractive Christian ethic. So in other words, we must guard our community ethic, for everything that we do flows from it. When we properly live together as a community of integrity, our lives are intertwined into a common, beautiful expression of God as we mimic him. So we must guard the community wellspring because everything flows from it. So now let's get to that list. Again, these are things you already know, but let's remind ourselves why they are important. First, we must practice honesty. As Paul says, each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor, for we are all members of one body. So as a community, we should care deeply about how we communicate with one another and before the world. If we play by the world's game of dishonesty, the water from our well is distasteful. So remember, we are members of the same church and we must speak honestly. Our unity depends on our truthful, honest expression. Therefore, put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor. We're also called to diffuse anger so that in our anger we do not sin. and do not let the sun go down while you are still angry. We need to get a handle on our anger quickly in order to resolve our differences quickly. There's nothing so unsettling as anger in our midst. If we don't develop a means to diffuse that anger in our congregational settings, we allow bitterness and evil to take root. And if we allow things to fester, Paul reminds us that we should not give the devil a foothold. Have you ever seen pictures of rock climbers? That scares the life out of me. Or mountain goats. Do you ever watch videos of mountain goats? Like, they only need a small surface along a sheer cliff to obtain a foothold. When we allow anger to remain for a long time, bitterness and resentment grow, and they allow evil intentions to obtain a position to dig in and from which to attack. And it's a small foothold. I'd need something much bigger. But I don't, and that's the whole point of what Paul is saying here. Believe me, I've seen several examples of how this destructive force can overtake even churches. Paul also wants us to steward our productivity. He calls on believers to exchange hands that steal for hands that help others. Anyone who has been stealing must steal no longer, but must work, doing something useful with their own hands, that they may have something to share with those in need. Again, the greater good of the community is involved here. It seems that Paul's interested in people's stewardship within church settings. People are either going to be contributors or freeloaders. Everyone has something to contribute in the welfare of the whole. Everyone. And if we're mimicking God, that should reveal how we provide for the sake of the least among us.
So, are you catching the attractive quality of this Christian ethic? It is heavy on the relational, the redemptive, and reflective. You can see that in each of these examples. And we must also guard what we say, speaking well of things. Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. Our conversational language should focus on building others up with a specific focus on them and their needs. It must be beneficial to others. How many of you have been around someone who is constantly tearing down other people? Maybe in the family, maybe at work, maybe even at church. It happens. Does this person's destructive language remain to himself, or does it sort of affect everything else in the family, at work, or at church? Speak to build others up and provide hope to those who listen. Now, this next one is a little bit unique, and Paul asks these believers to attend to the Spirit of God, where he says, do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, with whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. And so Paul's urging these Ephesians not to grieve their relationship with the Spirit. In fact, in 1 Thessalonians, Paul writes something similar. He urges believers not to quench or douse the Spirit. We sort of get the picture of a fire burning in our midst that we must tend. It's as if a fire burns in our midst and we each keep watch over it. We must allow the fire to remain strong. We should not be doing things that dampen the coals or cause the flames to weaken. Instead, we need to enliven them. When Joanne stepped up here to pray this morning, it was an example of attending to the Spirit, as she even mentioned the Spirit in that time. As I watch people go in and out of this prayer closet over here, we are attending to the Spirit. We are all responsible for the life of the Spirit within our church community. And this means that we also must avoid dangerous undercurrents that would affect the health of the community. Get rid of all these undercurrents, This bitterness, this rage, this anger, accusations is better than brawling, I think, and slander, along with every form of malice. When we look at this passage, all these descriptions reside under the surface. They are undercurrents, sort of like the dangerous riptides that threaten well-meaning swimmers at the beach.
Sort of like someone who needed the lifeguards to rescue him a few years ago.
Oh. Well, yeah, maybe. I wanted to ride the big waves, but soon realized that I was being pulled out further than I wanted to, so I told another swimmer to alert the lifeguards.
And all I know is that I saw the lifeguards running down the beach, and of course my thoughts is, now what clown got themselves into trouble?
Yeah, that was because I thought I needed them. The truth is, I actually made it back to the shore before they had to come out for me. I just wondered why my whole family pretended that they didn't know me anymore when I returned to our spot.
Yeah, he looked like a drowned rat, but I couldn't deny that everybody on either side under the umbrellas knew that he had been there earlier that day, so I had to admit that I knew him.
All right, anyway.
Just saying.
Undercurrents can be dangerous. They are often hidden in our relationships. They consume our thinking, and they cause us to make poor assumptions about others, even drowned rats. They are severe hindrances to the life of the church because they are hard to identify, because they lie under the surface. The things I describe here are not foreign in the life of the church. And ultimately, Paul says we are to be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. We must proactively apply and demonstrate the same grace that God has demonstrated toward us. Remember, we are to mimic God to one another and before a watching world. We are to lay aside our old corrupt garments and clothe ourselves in God's grace, in mimicking. And that means that we live by it, that grace flows from a pure wellspring and produces flourishing wherever it touches. When taken all together, this is an attractive Christian ethic that produces a community of integrity. When everything is applied, this thing called the church is going to make a huge difference. And the church will become a place of flourishing and hope.
Remember that wellspring that we're to guard? Can you see how we are to live representative lives of God's character and good actions? And how we are to do it together as a community? It's important because we are to be relational, redemptive, and reflective. It's as if we become an oasis of refreshment in the midst of a scorching desert wasteland. If our world is represented by the lifeless example of a desert living, residual anger, deceit, freeloading, tearing others down, swirling accusations and controversies, and bearing grudges, then we must offer people an oasis.
We can advance the slide. We should be on the next slide. Thank you.
Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5, God gave us the ministry of reconciliation, and he has committed us to the message of reconciliation, which means that we must abide by and practice a different ethic altogether, one that is representative of life with God, that's based on relationships joined together in a common, unified fellowship that pours out the healing that only God can give into one another's lives to bring restoration, and that continually reveals God's gracious spirit as we reflect his glory in our surrounding community. And when we do this, we become a place for flourishing even in a desert. If this thing called church is ever going to make a difference, it's because we not only claim to follow Jesus, but also follow an attractive Christian ethic that becomes a place where life flourishes because people put into practice the awareness of imitating God.
And in this way, we become Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. Now, an ambassador is someone living in a foreign land who represents the interests of their homeland. We are living as ambassadors in our communities, representing the interests of King Jesus and his kingdom, if you will. And it's the living out of these practices that allows God to make his appeal through us. You see that? The community ethic allows us to represent and allow God to make his appeal through us. So let me ask, how often does our surrounding culture see our attractive Christian ethic lived out? Not just here, I'm talking about across the world. Well, they see it when we practice honesty, diffuse anger, steward productivity, speak well of things, attend to the Spirit, and avoid undercurrents, and demonstrate grace. That's how it works. We must put off the idolatry of the world and put on the attractive Christian ethic, which mimics our God's attitudes and actions. And most of all, we must guard that wellspring, this source. A friend of mine, Tim, said a quote just on, I think it was Friday. He's reading Brian Zahn's book called The Wood Between the Worlds. And when he put this quote there, I was like, that's the perfect conclusion to today's message. Brian Zahn, by the way, was the guy that I was watching when I first came here and did the chairs. Some of you remember the chairs? That was Brian Zahn that I was watching to demonstrate that to you. But this is what he writes. And if you know my friend Tim, he always has long quotes. So this is a long quote.
Tim doesn't do anything short.
No, he doesn't. Christian ethics, writes Zahn, is ever an ongoing project that cannot be abandoned. Is he writing to us? Nevertheless, we live in a time when a post-Christian secular culture is deeply suspicious of any claim regarding ultimate truth or a superior ethic, especially when by the church. If the church in the secular West takes its stand in the marketplace of ideas by announcing, we have ultimate truth, we know what's good for you, and we meet at 10 o'clock on Sunday, the response will most likely be somewhere between shoulder shrugging, indifference, and outright scorn. The avenues of truth and goodness may for now be closed to the traffic of evangelism. I prefer the word witness here. But what about beauty, Zahn asks? What if witness could not be easily dismissed as petulant argument or puritanical moralism because it came by way of aesthetic? Beauty has a way of sneaking past our defenses. If in our witness to the world, we can set forth the incomparable beauty of Christ, and if we can learn to live beautiful lives in reflection of Christ, these are Zahn's words, hearts can be won even in a milieu of skepticism. It's through beauty that we fall in love, not through reason or argument. Oh boy, I lost my, there we go. This is still Zahn, let us tell our beautiful story and attempt to live beautiful lives. In evaluating what we do in our churches, we are accustomed to asking two questions. Is it true? Is it good? But now we need to ask and perhaps prioritize a third question. Is it beautiful? So if this thing called church is ever going to make a difference,